What if I told you that behind the polished portraits, strict morals, and endless sermons of Victorian England, there lived a secret world filled with hidden love, coded signals, scandalous trials, and laughter that defied the law? Imagine Gaslit. Streets where a simple flower and a lapel could change everything, where letters sealed with trembling hands carried confessions that could ruin or redeem a life, where artists painted beauty with secret meanings, and where men and women built entire households of devotion that history refused to name. This is not the dull, dusty Victorian age you were taught. It is a story of courage and silence, of passion written in code, of resilience stronger than repression. Tonight, we unlock the untold history of homosexuality in the Victorian era. This world lived in whispers but beats loudly once more, and if you stay with me, you'll discover a hidden side of history that will forever change the way you see the past. In Victorian England, there existed an entire hidden world that official history either ignored or deliberately erased. A world where love between men, and sometimes between women, was whispered about in shadow corners, expressed through coded glances in lamplit streets, and preserved in letters that could never be read aloud. And tonight, as you lie back in your bed, listening perhaps to the rain tapping at your window or the muffled quiet of your room, you are about to step into that world, softly, carefully, as though you are lifting the lid on a long-forgotten box of secrets. While the rest of history books speak loudly of wars, of industry, of empire, this story breathes more gently, in sighs, in silence, in hidden laughter, in grief that had no voice, and in quiet acts of love that defied the age that condemned them. Our story begins in the heart of London, a city that was by turns brilliant and cruel, its gas lamps glowing through the fog, its cobbled streets filled with the sound of horse hooves striking stone, its great houses built on wealth from empire, its back alleys alive with the voices of hawkers, beggars, and those whose lives pass unnoticed by polite society. Within this world, some men lived two lives. The one they wore in public, buttoned up in waistcoats, collars starched, conversations polite and respectable, and the one they lived in private, when the eyes of the world turned away, when desire crept into their hearts and they reached toward those they were told they must never touch. Gentle listener, before we step deeper, take a slow breath. Feel yourself sinking into comfort and allow the dim world of the Victorian night to form in your mind. Perhaps you imagine yourself walking along the Thames embankment just after dusk, the air damp and smelling faintly of coal smoke from 1,000 chimneys, the faint ripple of water against stone walls below, the sound of a violin being played in some distant tavern, and along the path men stroll, some alone, some in twos, their hats low, their coats buttoned tight, their footsteps quickening if a stranger's gaze lingers too long. You might not realize it at first, but in these very streets an entire coded language existed, a hidden lexicon of looks, words, gestures that could mean everything or nothing, depending on who observed them. For in this society where even the whisper of desire between men could lead to ruin, people developed ways of speaking without words, of seeing without being seen, of existing in a twilight of suggestion. There was the world of law and the world of life. The law in Victorian Britain, particularly after 1885, when the Labouchere Amendment was introduced, criminalized what was called gross indecency, a vague phrase that could encompass nearly any form of intimacy between men. To be accused was to risk prison, hard labor, and the destruction of reputation. Yet long before 1885, same-sex acts were already criminalized under older statutes, punishments ranging from imprisonment to public shaming. And yet in spite of the danger, life pulsed in secret rooms and hidden gardens, for desire has always found a way to breathe. The contradiction was sharp. This was the same era that prided itself on morality, on domestic virtue, on the image of the respectable family home. Yet behind drawn curtains, and within societies of artists, actors, and students, there was experimentation, passion, and networks of connection that stretched from London to Paris to Berlin. Imagine being a young man in 1870, perhaps working as a clerk by day, surrounded by ledgers, ink stains, and the dull shuffle of papers. Yet at night, drawn to the parks of the city, where one might encounter another figure standing under a lamppost. Too long, a sign that was obvious to those who knew. Invisible to those who did not dot, there were places infamous for this hidden traffic. The dark corners of Hyde Park, the steps around the British Museum, the arcades and bathhouses where men of every class mingled in ways society pretended could never happen. Some of these encounters were fleeting, some tender, some dangerous, for the risk of being discovered was constant. Newspapers printed sensational stories whenever a scandal was uncovered, always using language that condemned, never one that humanized, and yet between the lines you can sometimes sense the unspoken fascination. At the same time, in private, correspondence between men of letters, artists, and intellectuals, you find expressions of affection that could not be spoken openly. In diaries hidden away in country houses, in letters exchanged and then carefully burned, in coded poems published anonymously, the texture of love endured. We must remember also the case of Oscar Wilde, which would later come to define the very image of Victorian homosexuality in the popular mind. But Wilde's trial in 1895 was not the beginning. It was merely the eruption into public view of what had existed for generations. Wilde, with his wit, his flamboyance, his circle of young men, became the lightning rod for the anxieties of his age. Yet behind him stretched countless unnamed lives, who never saw a courtroom, but who lived daily with the same tension between yearning and fear. What fascinates is not only the danger, but the inventiveness of survival. They invented codes of dress, of language, of behavior. A green carnation in the lapel, for instance, was at one point used as a symbol, discreet yet obvious to those who understood. In literature, too, writers hinted at what could not be said. References to classical myths of Ganymede, to the Greek love admired in ancient texts, were ways of cloaking contemporary desires under the veil of scholarship that the world of women is harder to trace, for while the law and society largely ignored female same-sex relationships, dismissing them as either non-existent or irrelevant, there were passionate friendships between women that crossed into physical intimacy, letters filled with longing phrases, houses shared for lifetimes, yet often remembered by history as nothing more than companionship. In truth, they were marriages in all but name. Think of the ladies of Llangollen, two women in the late 18th century whose life together stretched into the Victorian age, remembered by their neighbors as eccentric, but who in their devotion carved out a life, a partnership despite the world around them. Victorian culture made space for what it called romantic friendships among women, and within those friendships, intimacy could thrive under the guise of innocence. The darker side of this hidden world, however, was the constant threat of exposure. Men arrested in police raids on parks or pubs faced not only trial, but the destruction of everything they had built. Employers dismissed them, families disowned them, friends vanished. In prison they faced hard labor, silence, and the weight of shame pressed down by society. Even so, some men resisted. Letters smuggled out of prison cells described tenderness that survived punishment. Diaries reveal moments of humor, even in the face of danger, as when one man described how police, utterly oblivious, failed to understand the double meaning of conversations happening right under their noses. Humor and fear intertwined, because laughter was a way to survive. The Victorians were masters of contradiction. They celebrated male friendship in poetry and art, yet drew a sharp line the moment friendship was suspected of becoming love. They embraced the beauty of the Greek past, where same-sex love was celebrated in myth and philosophy, yet condemned its presence in their own time. They adored novels full of unspoken longing, but punished those who lived longing in reality. The very strictness of the society created the conditions for a world rich in secret signals, hidden networks, whispered poetry, and coded gestures. And so, in this story, you will hear not only about laws and scandals, but about the texture of life lived in the shadows of empire, where even silence could be an act of rebellion, and where desire, though forbidden, left its fingerprints across The age dot as the gas lamps burned across the city and the fog thickened in the narrow streets. The lives of men and women who loved differently from the expectations of their time unfolded in ways both fragile and astonishing. And to picture this, you must imagine the hidden geography of desire that laced itself through London and beyond. A geography not marked on any official map, yet known to those who move carefully within it, where a casual touch of a gloved hand or the prolonged glance exchanged under the shadow of a lamppost carried the weight of 1,000 forbiddens. Confessions. If you walked into certain pubs near the Strand or into the theaters of the West End, you might find yourself in the presence of men whose voices carried with exaggerated wit, whose manner of dress was a little too flamboyant for the stern codes of masculinity enforced by society, and within those spaces an unspoken recognition flickered like candlelight. Theaters, in particular, offered refuge. Actors lived already at the margins of respectability, their profession seen as disreputable by the rigid guardians of Victorian morality. And in that looseness, in that ambiguity, there was room for other forms of looseness to breathe. Dressing rooms, after parties, private salons hosted by patrons with taste for art as well as for youth, became havens where love and desire could be expressed with a kind of careless laughter that was impossible under daylight. Yet danger was never far, for police kept watch and newspapers thrived on scandal. The very spaces that allowed joy also risked betrayal, and stories of men blackmailed by their lovers, threatened with exposure unless they paid money or surrendered letters, became frighteningly common. For those who did not belong to the artistic world, secrecy had to be woven more delicately. The working class men who sought each other out in public parks often did so under conditions of extreme risk. The molly houses of earlier centuries, taverns or inns where men gathered, had largely disappeared under Victorian repression, but new meeting points arose. Public urinals, newly built by city planners to maintain cleanliness, became notorious sites of clandestine encounters. So common were these that they became known as cottages, a word that would survive into modern slang as cottaging. Police raids in such places filled the newspapers with sensational accounts, the details always dripping with moral condemnation. Yet within those details we glimpse how strong the pull of human need remained. Men of all classes passed through those doorways. A laborer might find himself beside a clerk, a soldier beside a gentleman. For a brief moment, class divisions blurred in the face of desire. And though the danger of entrapment was ever present, still the encounters continued, because hunger of the body and the heart cannot be legislated away. The middle-class men who wished for more privacy sometimes turned to private clubs. London had hundreds of gentlemen's clubs, most devoted to politics, literature, or sport. Yet within their paneled rooms and libraries, there were also friendships that crossed into intimacy. In the quiet of a smoking room, late at night, with port and brandy flowing, words could turn into confessions, and confessions into touches. Diaries of certain Victorians reveal long nights spent in such company, recorded obliquely in coded phrases that required sympathetic eyes to understand. The very respectability of the setting shielded what might occur within it, because society refused to admit that men of good breeding could possibly indulge in such acts. That denial created space for secrecy, and secrecy became survival.at. The same time, intellectual life provided another form of cover. University settings, particularly at Oxford and Cambridge, were famous for their romantic friendships. Young men, away from their families, immersed in the study of classical texts that celebrated Greek love, often found themselves enchanted by one another. The poetry of the time reflects this in delicate verses that speak of friendship with a fervor that seems to exceed mere companionship. Professors and tutors looked away, or even quietly encouraged bonds that mirrored the ancient relationships between teacher and pupil celebrated in Greek philosophy. Later in life, some of these friendships hardened into silence as men married and performed their duty to family, but the memory of those youthful affections remained. Inscribed in letters that speak of longing across decades, the Victorians themselves sometimes betrayed the knowledge of these hidden, lives even as they publicly condemned them. Medical journals of the time began to write about what they termed inversion, a pseudo-scientific attempt to classify homosexuality as a kind of illness or congenital abnormality. The word homosexual itself entered English in the late 19th century through these medical debates. Doctors dissected confessions, wrote case histories, and attempted to pin down desire into categories. Yet in doing so, they preserved details of lives that otherwise would have been lost. One man confessed to a physician that he could not remember a time he was not drawn to other men. Another described his longing as an affliction that shadowed him since childhood. These voices, though filtered through the language of pathology, remain as testimony. We might hear in them pain, confusion, but also honesty rarely allowed elsewhere. The paradox is that even attempts to condemn create archives of survival. Women, too, navigated this landscape, though with greater invisibility. The notion that two women could share romantic intimacy was either dismissed as harmless or simply refused acknowledgement by society at large. Yet within that blind spot, entire lives of love unfolded. The letters between certain women, like Anne Lister in the earlier 19th century, whose diaries continued into the Victorian age, burn with a passion unmistakable in its clarity. Anne Lister referred to herself as marrying her female partner in secret, a bond sanctified by their vows and lives together, though invisible to church or law. Other women formed what were called Boston marriages, lifelong domestic partnerships between two women who shared a household, finances, and love. To neighbors, they were simply eccentric spinsters who preferred each other's company. To themselves, they were wives in all but name. In their daily lives of gardening, letter writing, music, and devotion, they carved out a freedom denied to many men because society chose not to see them clearly. The press, however, delighted in scandal when it involved public figures. Stories of aristocrats accused of indecency or soldiers court-martialed for affairs with their comrades filled columns with lurid detail. In 1870, one case in Dublin saw a military officer dragged before the court, his private letters read aloud as evidence. The humiliation was total, for in Victorian logic, shame was part of the punishment. Yet those same court transcripts now preserve words of love and longing that might otherwise have vanished. In their unintended way, the very acts of persecution record the reality of affection. Beneath the cruel laughter of journalists, the careful lines of court stenographers fixed forever the tenderness that law tried to destroy dot, and always there was the shadow of class. For working class men, discovery often meant simple dismissal and imprisonment, yet life went on after release, for anonymity allowed them to disappear and rebuild elsewhere. For gentlemen, discovery meant absolute ruin. A single scandal could collapse entire families, strip away fortune, and leave reputation shattered. That disproportionate fear drove many into silence, forced into marriages to preserve appearances. Their truest selves left to whisper only in private notes and brief meetings. The cruelty of respectability was such that it demanded masks from everyone, and those masks often left deep wounds. Yet within those wounds grew resilience. Humor, art, coded references in novels, sly jokes in plays, all of these became ways to assert existence. There were even charities and reformers who, though they did not speak openly, worked quietly to lessen the burden. Certain figures within the medical world argued that punishment was cruel, that these men and women were not criminals but simply different. They were rare and often ignored, but their voices hinted at a slow change. Literature, too, played its part. Poets like Walt Whitman, whose words crossed the Atlantic, inspired a sense that love between men was noble, not shameful. Readers who found themselves reflected in those lines felt less alone, even if they could never say so publicly. And so the Victorian era, remembered for prudishness, repression, and rigidity, was also an age of hidden tenderness, of risks taken. For the sake of a kiss, of friendships that were more than friendship, of secret symbols pinned to lapels, of laughter that carried double meanings, of prisons filled with those who dared too much, of diaries stained with ink where longing was. Confessed. Every street, every park, every drawing room carried shadows of these lives. History books did not write them down, but they were there, beating hearts within the machinery of empire. To listen to their story is to listen to the quiet beneath. The thunder, the whispers beneath the sermons, the truths that no punishment could ever fully erase. The story of homosexuality in the Victorian era is not only about shadows and whispers, but also about the ways people created entire emotional worlds within restrictions. And to imagine this, one must walk into the parlors, libraries, and boarding houses where subtlety was everything, where a letter sealed with too much warmth could carry more meaning than an entire speech, where a pause in conversation, a hand resting a fraction too long on another, was charged with possibility, and where life became an exercise in reading signs, in speaking without speaking. In boarding schools, boys lived together from their earliest teens, and the intensity of that environment produced bonds that were spoken of as friendship, but often carried far more weight. Letters home described the romantic attachments that formed between students, attachments their teachers sometimes tolerated, sometimes punished, depending on how visible they became. These relationships could be tender, full of poetry, secret gifts, and long walks. And though many dissolved as students left school for careers and marriages, some endured quietly into adulthood, disguised as lifelong friendship. The endurance of affection through decades of silence shows the persistence of something that could not be extinguished by law or social expectation. In homes across the country, wealthy bachelors lived with companions, relationships remembered by relatives, as eccentric arrangements, but within which devotion thrived. They built households, collected art, traveled together, and were buried side by side, leaving behind tombstones that, to those who know how to read them, mark out not just friendship but something deeper in cities. The underworld of prostitution also intersected with homosexuality. Young men, often impoverished, offered their company for money to wealthier men, sometimes in alleys, sometimes in rented rooms. Court records detail the arrest of boys accused of sodomy alongside charges of theft or vagrancy. Yet behind the lurid language of the courts, there is evidence of networks that operated much like heterosexual prostitution, with regular clients, codes, and protective arrangements. Some of these encounters were exploitative, born of desperation, but others suggest companionship that lasted longer than a single night. Relationships of dependence and care formed within the structure of transaction. To read the fragments left in newspapers and police files is to glimpse a spectrum of intimacy ranging from fleeting to enduring, all concealed behind words chosen to shame. What is striking is that even in spaces considered the most degraded, the hunger for connection remained unmistakably human among the middle classes. Secrecy required even greater creativity. The system of correspondence itself became a lifeline. Letters written in invisible ink, coded phrases about Greek interests, or references to classical myths provided layers of meaning for those in the know. To an outsider, the words seemed harmless. To the recipient, they were declarations of love or longing. Collectors of antiquities and books often surrounded themselves with volumes that included coded references to same-sex love, allowing them to cultivate a private world that reflected their desires without ever stating them aloud. One might imagine a scholar sitting late at night in a lamp-lit study, leafing through a translation of Plato, lingering on passages about male friendship, and feeling seen across centuries by words that offered recognition when the present world refused it. The very act of reading became an intimate rebellion, a way of affirming self in defiance of silence. Religion added yet another layer of complexity. Victorian Britain was deeply Christian, and sermons thundered against any perceived vice. Yet within the ritual of confession and the quiet of prayer, people wrestled with desires they were told to renounce. Some believed themselves damned, recording their torment in diaries that speak of nightly weeping, prayers for deliverance, and desperate attempts to conform. Others found in faith a strange kind of refuge, interpreting biblical friendship stories, like that of David and Jonathan, as divine sanction for their feelings. In hymn singing, in shared devotion, in quiet companionship on the pew, love disguised itself as piety. The contradiction was unbearable for some, yet for others, it allowed them to hold their affection within a sacred frame, one the world could not entirely strip away. The empire itself spread these hidden patterns far beyond Britain. Soldiers stationed in India, Africa, or the Caribbean carried with them the strict codes of Victorian morality, yet the intimacy of military life fostered bonds that blurred those codes. Barracks were filled with men who lived in close quarters, sharing danger and exhaustion. Court records from colonial outposts describe trials of men accused of indecency with their comrades. But letters home from soldiers also hint at the tenderness of companionship forged under stress. In colonies where British law was exported, the same condemnations were imposed, creating legacies of legal persecution that persisted long after empire collapsed. Yet even in distant garrisons, love and desire whispered through the cracks of regulation, reminding us that repression could never fully succeed. Writers, too, played a role in preserving this hidden history, though most avoided explicitness. Novels and poems included characters and relationships that carried queer undertones. Critics often debated whether these were mere aesthetic flourishes or veiled confessions, but readers who identified with them knew otherwise. Walt Whitman's poetry, imported from America, was read in Britain by men who recognized in his calamus poems an unashamed celebration of male love. In drawing rooms and book clubs, discussions of Whitman sometimes revealed as much about the reader as about the poet, and copies of his books, annotated and treasured, circulated among those seeking affirmation. English poets, too, slipped moments of longing into their verse, knowing that most readers would miss the significance, but trusting that some would not. The danger of exposure never lessened. Police raids in London continued through the century, and entrapment became a common tactic. Officers disguised themselves to lure men into propositions, then arrested them. Trials ruined lives, yet they also exposed the hypocrisy of a society that consumed scandal while pretending to uphold virtue. Journalists relished the chance to describe in lurid detail the very behaviors they condemned, and in doing so, they preserved descriptions of lives otherwise erased. One can almost hear the double voice in such articles, disgust and fascination woven together, revealing that repression often masked curiosity. The public devoured these stories, shaking their heads in moral outrage while secretly intrigued. The spectacle of condemnation became entertainment. Despite it all, resilience shone through. Humor became a form of resistance. Men joked among themselves about the ignorance of the authorities, about the absurdity of medical classifications, about the clumsy attempts of journalists to sensationalize what they barely understood. Behind the humor lay defiance. In the salons of artists, in the smoky back rooms of taverns, in the whispered conversations of parks, laughter softened fear and affirmed solidarity. Women, too, found ways to laugh at the pretenses of neighbors who labeled them spinsters while ignoring the obvious truth of their devotion. In gardens they cultivated together, in firesides shared year after year, they wove a life of ordinary beauty that mocked the world's refusal to see it. To reflect on this hidden world is to recognize how deeply human need for love and connection persists even under threat of punishment. The Victorians built walls of morality, but those walls were never solid. Through cracks and gaps, light filtered in, and within that light, men and women created spaces where tenderness survived. The coded gestures, the private diaries, the guarded friendships, the clandestine meetings, all speak of lives lived fully, though never freely. To listen to their history is to listen to courage not expressed in battles or speeches, but in the simple act of continuing to love when the world insisted that love was a crime. In the quiet corners of the Victorian world, intimacy flourished, not only in shadows but also within the arts, where painters, poets, and playwrights often threaded forbidden desire through their work, trusting that only those attuned to such signals would notice. And to imagine this, you must picture the smoky, Studio of an artist in Chelsea, canvases leaning against the walls, the smell of turpentine thick in the air. And on the easel, a half-finished portrait of a young man, his features lingering on the edge of beauty, his gaze directed not outward to the viewer, but inward to the painter himself, a silent testament to a bond neither could declare. The Victorian era was filled with such portraits, images celebrated as aesthetic studies of form, but quietly charged with more personal meaning. In literature, poets revived the language of the ancients to cloak their feelings, invoking Plato, Virgil, and Greek mythology as ways of saying what could not be spoken directly. To write of Ganymede or Apollo was to echo centuries of coded reference, and those who long recognized themselves in those mythic mirrors. The pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, with its emphasis on sensual beauty and rich color, often blurred the lines of desire in their works, and while the public admired their depictions of women, within their circle friendships between men carried undertones that art itself reflected. A simple painting of two male figures gazing at one another in shared intensity could hold layers of meaning for those who understood its quiet defiance. Beyond the arts, the growing world of science and classification shaped the way Victorians thought about love and identity. The emergence of sexology, with figures like Karl Heinrich Ulrich's in Germany and later Havelock Ellis in Britain, introduced new language to describe same-sex desire, sometimes pathologizing it, sometimes attempting to argue for tolerance. Ulrich spoke of Uranians, a third sex who embodied male love for men, and though his ideas were ridiculed in many circles, they provided a vocabulary that some embraced. For men and women who had never seen their feelings named, this was revolutionary, even if the context was often medical or clinical. Ellis, in the late Victorian period, corresponded with men who confided their experiences, collecting testimony that now provides invaluable glimpses into lived realities. These attempts at understanding, however flawed, marked the beginning of a shift from silence toward discourse. In libraries and lecture halls, men quietly sought out these works, reading them late at night under dim lamplight, feeling at once scrutinized and strangely validated. Even as the language of science framed them as abnormal, they recognized in the descriptions echoes of their own lives, and that recognition itself became a form of solace. Within private spaces, rituals of survival developed. In drawing rooms and parlors, respectable men and women gathered for evenings of poetry, music, and debate, but beneath the civility ran currents of attraction. Some gatherings became known discreetly as places where those of particular sensibilities could find each other. Invitations were whispered, memberships carefully guarded. Behind closed doors, conversation loosened, hands brushed, and laughter carried a different resonance. Wealthy patrons sometimes used their homes to shelter younger companions, providing financial support and opportunities in exchange for intimacy and companionship. While outsiders might assume these relationships were transactional, diaries suggest that genuine affection often grew between protector and protege. Affection, deepened by shared secrecy. To step into one of these salons was to enter a parallel world where, for a few hours, men and women could exhale without fear of discovery. For those less fortunate, the streets remained the only refuge. Along the dark paths of Kensington Gardens or the secluded stretches of Hampstead Heath, encounters unfolded under cover of night. The sound of leaves rustling, the glow of gaslight at a distance, the hurried whispers between strangers formed the soundtrack of 1,000 stories never written down. Arrest records cataloged some of these encounters, but what they could not capture was the longing, the pulse of adrenaline, the quiet thrill of a meeting stolen from the grip of a repressive world. These encounters were dangerous, yet they also carried a spark of liberation. For a moment, beneath the branches and the night sky, individuals who felt invisible by day affirmed their existence through touch and gaze. The memory of such moments lingered long after, written in private journals or held silently within the heart. Scandal was the sword that society wielded, and nowhere was this clearer than in the treatment of public figures. The downfall of Oscar Wilde still casts a long shadow over Victorian history, but countless lesser-known men endure quieter versions of the same fate. An indiscreet letter intercepted by a family member, a servant's gossip overheard, a chance encounter witnessed. By the wrong eyes, any of these could lead to ruin. Newspapers reveled in these exposures, dripping with moral outrage while carefully detailing every salacious element for their readers' consumption. The spectacle of judgment became entertainment, and yet within those reports, we can trace the outlines of lives otherwise invisible. Each trial transcript, each scandalized editorial, inadvertently preserved fragments of truth, words of endearment, descriptions of meetings, the very texture of desire that law sought to erase. Women navigated the same terrain with slightly different tools. Because their relationships were less policed by law, they could maintain households together under the guise of companionship, but that did not spare them from gossip. Neighbors might whisper about two women who never married, who shared a home for decades, who wrote to one another in tones of passion, but society largely dismissed such unions as eccentric. This dismissal, paradoxically, provided cover. Within that invisibility, women created lives of quiet devotion. They built gardens, composed music, wrote letters full of tenderness. Their love left fewer public traces, but in diaries and preserved. Correspondence, and in the very architecture of the homes they inhabited, their presence endures. To read their words is to hear the voice of longing softened by domestic ritual, of passion interwoven with the ordinary rhythms of daily life. The contradictions of the age stand out most clearly in its culture of masculinity. Victorians celebrated intense male friendships in literature, poetry, and even in public life. Politicians wrote flowery letters to one another. Soldiers spoke of bonds stronger than marriage. Poets described friendships with near-erotic devotion. These expressions were accepted so long as they remained cloaked in the language of idealized virtue. The moment such friendships seemed too embodied, too physical, the line was drawn. This double standard reveals how close love and friendship were allowed to approach before society recoiled. It also provided cover for those who learned to walk the fine line, expressing what they felt while disguising it as mere camaraderie. The tension between what could be said and what could not became the very space where identity was formed. Even the architecture of Victorian cities bore witness to these lives. The new public spaces, parks, libraries, arcades became stages for encounters both innocent and illicit. A man sitting too long with another in a reading room, a pair of friends strolling arm in arm down Pall Mall, a chance meeting in the corridor of a museum all could carry more significance than the world chose to recognize. The city itself became a silent accomplice, offering shadows and corners, alcoves and passages where connection might unfold unseen. These physical structures remain, their bricks and stones holding stories untold, reminding us that history is not only written in documents, but also inscribed in the spaces where people dared to reach for one another. And so, when we think of the Victorian era as merely prudish and repressive, we miss the quiet rebellion that infused daily life. For every sermon against vice, there was a whispered confession. For every law passed to criminalize, there was a diary entry filled with longing. For every scandal splashed across newspapers, there were 100 tender moments lived beyond the gaze of authority. To trace this hidden history is to walk through a city of echoes, where the unrecorded heartbeats of men and women continue to reverberate, reminding us that even in the most restrictive of ages, love, in all its forms, found ways to endure. To look deeper into Victorian life is to see how same-sex love shaped not only the hidden corners of private existence, but also the broader cultural imagination. And one striking example lies in the poetry and letters that circulated quietly among circles of friends. Words that often carried a double meaning, outwardly innocent, yet saturated with secret devotion, so that to an untrained eye they seemed to be simple exercises in sentiment, but to those who longed for recognition, they blazed like fire. The habit of men writing to one another in effusive tones was so common in the 19th century that even passionate declarations could be disguised as ordinary expressions of friendship. And within this cultural loophole, many men poured their hearts into letters they hoped would never be read by hostile eyes. Some letters survived because they were hidden in trunks, tied with ribbon, discovered decades later by descendants unsure of their significance. Others were intercepted and used as evidence in trials, humiliating their authors, yet inadvertently preserving their voices for history. One reads lines such as, "I cannot wait for the next moment when I am beside you. For every absence is an ache," or "You are the light by which I measure my days." Phrases that reveal not only passion, but a deep emotional reliance. These fragments remind us that beneath the harsh laws, love insisted on being written, on existing in ink, even when it was dangerous. The influence of classical education provided another cloak for desire. Victorian boys studied Greek and Latin extensively, and the admiration of Greek ideals of beauty and friendship often slid into a subtle endorsement of same-sex affection. Teachers and students alike referred to platonic love, a phrase that sometimes concealed what was in fact far less abstract. The very act of translating Plato's Symposium or Virgil's Eclogues invited reflection on the legitimacy of male love, and those reflections were sometimes quietly lived out in college courtyards and cloisters. University archives contain poems exchanged between students that, though never explicit, thrum with longing, their authors borrowing the language of antiquity to mask feelings that could not be openly confessed. In this way, the ancients became allies, offering models of affection that Victorians could reference without overtly exposing themselves. It was an intellectual strategy as much as an emotional one, a way of allowing desire to breathe beneath. The cover of Scholarship. For women, literature provided a similar refuge. Novels such as Charlotte Bronte's Villette or later works like Sarah Grant's writings carried undertones of female intimacy that readers attuned to them could recognize. More importantly, women themselves wrote letters to each other, filled with affection, often preserved within family papers. Some spoke of sharing beds night after night, of dreaming together, of building entire worlds of devotion that lasted decades. These were not always dismissed as scandalous because society often refused to imagine that women could feel such passion for one another. But precisely in that refusal lay freedom. They could write what they wished, and though some censored their words with euphemisms, others let their longing flow unashamed. In diaries kept by women like Anne Lister, written partly in code, the passion is unmistakable, describing embraces, kisses, and the fierce determination to live authentically, even when the world offered no recognition. Such writings remind us that female love was not absent in the Victorian world, but simply less policed, allowing it to flourish in quieter but no less intense forms. Public scandals often shattered these fragile worlds. The trial of Oscar Wilde is the most famous, but throughout the centuries, smaller cases revealed how vulnerable individuals were to exposure. One man might be betrayed by a lover seeking money, another by a servant who stumbled across incriminating letters, another by the simple misfortune of being observed in a park at the wrong hour. The law, particularly after the 1885 Labouche Amendment, required no proof of physical acts. Mere implication of gross indecency was enough to destroy a life. Courtrooms became theaters of humiliation, where love letters were read aloud to audiences eager for salacious detail, while the men who wrote them stood ashamed and broken. Yet those very court transcripts now allow us to hear words of affection, in their rawest form, stripped of privacy but preserved forever, a paradox of cruelty and survival. Through these humiliations, history gained an archive it otherwise would not possess. Beyond scandal, everyday life continued, and within it, small rituals of survival formed. Men recognized each other through subtle codes. A green carnation in a buttonhole, a certain turn of phrase, an invitation to meet for a walk that carried meanings outsiders would never suspect. Humor softened the danger with inside jokes. Exchanged in salons and gatherings, laughter covering fear with the comfort of recognition. Women, too, developed their own ways of affirming bonds through the exchange of gifts, locks of hair, or rings inscribed with initials. These tokens, though ordinary in appearance, bore immense emotional weight, becoming symbols of vows no church would bless, but which in their hearts carried more permanence than many sanctioned marriages. These quiet rituals speak of resilience, of determination to create meaning in lives denied legitimacy. The contradictions of the Victorian world extended even into its architecture and public design. The very creation of public urinals in parks meant to improve sanitation and provide wholesome recreation, inadvertently created spaces for clandestine meetings. Police knew these places well and often patrolled them, yet the encounters continued. The city became both enemy and ally, a landscape where danger and possibility coexisted. Similarly, theaters, music halls, and private clubs offered double lives. Respectable entertainment on the surface, secret signals beneath. The city itself seemed complicit, its gas lamps illuminating both virtue and transgression, its fog providing cover for both crime and passion dot at the same time colonial. Service spread these dynamics far beyond Britain. Men posted to India, Africa, or the Caribbean wrote letters describing their loneliness, their reliance on comrades, their longing for touch in environments far from home. Court records from colonial stations document charges of indecency, but letters preserved in archives also speak of companionship, of devotion that made hardship bearable. These fragments remind us that same-sex love was not confined to metropolitan centers, but extended across the empire, shaped by distance, exile, and the peculiar intimacy of life lived in outposts of power. What emerges from all of this is a picture of resilience, creativity, and profound humanity. Despite laws that sought to erase them, despite scandals that tried to shame them, despite medical theories that labeled them as abnormal, men and women of the Victorian age loved, desired, and created lives of meaning. Their strategies of survival codes, literature, humor, secrecy, companionship reveal an unyielding truth. Love cannot be extinguished by repression. It adapts, it hides, it transforms, but it endures. To read their letters, to imagine their meetings under the glow of gaslight, to hear their laughter echoing through smoky salons or across quiet gardens, is to recognize not aberration but continuity. The same human need for connection that has always existed and always will doubt to understand more deeply the hidden life of homosexuality in the Victorian era. One must step into the texture of ordinary days, where beneath the surface of strict propriety, there be countless private rhythms of desire and affection. And these rhythms shape lives in ways that remain largely invisible in official records, but can still be glimpsed through scattered fragments left behind. Consider the morning routines of a middle-class household, where the father read his newspaper by the fire, the mother prepared for visitors, and the children studied their lessons, while a bachelor uncle, perhaps always described as eccentric, or devoted to art, quietly corresponded with a friend whose letters never reached the family table, but were kept locked away in a drawer, reread at night with trembling hands. In small villages, as much as in great cities, there were men and women who formed bonds hidden in plain sight, bonds that neighbors might dismiss with a shrug, unwilling to think too deeply about what they implied. And yet within those bonds were lives of devotion that carried on for decades. Imagine two school teachers sharing a home for 40 years, walking together through cobbled lanes, tending the same garden, their companionship recorded in parish notes as simple friendship, when in reality it was something far more intimate. A quiet marriage lived without recognition in the working class districts of London. The situation carried a different texture. There, anonymity was both protection and risk. A dock worker, a soldier on leave, a shop assistant, all might seek one another's company in taverns or on dimly lit streets. And though danger of exposure remained constant, the churn of urban life provided a measure of concealment. If discovered, punishment could be harsh, but anonymity allowed many to rebuild by moving to a new neighborhood where no one knew their history. This fluidity created networks that shifted constantly, places where men recognized one another not through names but through gestures, familiar haunts, and fleeting exchanges of trust. Among these were pubs that became known for their tolerant atmosphere, where landlords quietly looked the other way as long as the behavior did not invite police attention. Within such spaces, laughter echoed, music played, and touches were exchanged under the cover of conviviality. For a few hours, men could exist more freely than the world outside allowed, sustained by the warmth of company and the courage of community. The tension between visibility and invisibility shaped every aspect of these lives. To be too visible risked disaster, yet to be invisible meant erasure, and so people found ways to balance on that knife edge. Some sought out art and literature that carried echoes of their desires, finding solace in the coded references of poets and the illusions of playwrights. A well-chosen book in a library could be a lifeline, a whisper across time that said, "You are not alone." Others turned to private rituals, writing diaries in cipher, developing personal codes of symbols, or preserving small tokens of affection hidden within furniture and clothing. These acts may seem small, yet they carried immense emotional weight, for they affirmed existence in a world that denied it. Every coded entry, every folded scrap of paper, every carefully guarded memento was a declaration that love and longing, though forbidden, remain real. Even in marriage, traces of same-sex love endured. Many men and women conformed to expectation, marrying and raising families, yet maintained secret lives alongside their public roles. A husband might keep a circle of friends whose intimacy exceeded what was acknowledged, or a wife might maintain a correspondence with another woman filled with tenderness unspoken to her spouse. These arrangements required careful balance, and the strain often spilled into diaries where frustration and sorrow mingled with devotion. The dual existence demanded. By Victorian respectability left deep scars, yet it also produced resilience. Some couples found ways to weave honesty into their lives, reaching quiet understandings with their spouses, while others lived in perpetual secrecy, burdened by the constant need to conceal. The weight of silence pressed heavily, but even silence contained its own kind of speech. The role of the law remained central in shaping these lives. The Labouchere Amendment of 1885 widened the scope of criminality, transforming suspicion itself into danger. Men who had never been caught in acts of intimacy were prosecuted for mere suggestion, for letters, for innuendo. Blackmail flourished. In this climate, with unscrupulous individuals exploiting the fear of exposure to extort money from the vulnerable. Cases of blackmail appear again and again in records, revealing how widespread the threat became. Yet within this darkness there were also moments of defiance. Some men, rather than surrender, fought their accusers in court, attempting to defend their love as natural, though the courts rarely listened. Their courage, even when punished, left a faint trail for future generations to follow, showing that silence was not absolute, that voices were raised, however faint, against injustice. Colonial expansion continued to spread both repression and connection. In India, soldiers and administrators enforced British laws criminalizing same-sex acts. Yet correspondence reveals that relationships still form, hidden within the intimacy of expatriate communities. In the Caribbean, in Africa, in far-flung garrisons, the same patterns repeated. Prohibition on the surface, connection beneath. The legacy of these laws endured long after the empire itself collapsed, shaping societies across the globe. Yet, those same colonies became places where the isolation of service, the closeness of barracks, and the bonds of shared hardship gave rise to affections that might never have emerged at home. The contradictions of empire thus carried forward both repression and possibility, entwining desire with the machinery of power. Religion, too, remained both enemy and refuge. Preachers thundered against sin, declaring eternal punishment for those who strayed, yet within the pews sat men and women silently yearning. Some took comfort in biblical friendships, drawing parallels between their own feelings and the bond of David and Jonathan, or Ruth and Naomi. Others wrestled with guilt, writing prayers of anguish into their journals. The dissonance between faith and desire produced torment, yet also creativity, as individuals sought ways to reconcile the two. Hymns sung together, prayers whispered in unison, even the ritual of confession, all became spaces where affection could be felt beneath the language of devotion. For some, religion intensified their sense of shame. For others, it sanctified their love in ways the world never could. Through all of this, humor and imagination provided resilience. Men joked about the ignorance of police, mocked the absurdities of medical theories, and exchanged playful nicknames that concealed identities while affirming community. Women cultivated gardens together, naming flowers after each other, building entire worlds of symbolism understood only by them. These acts of playfulness softened the edge of fear and created spaces of joy within repression. To imagine their lives fully is to see not only suffering but also creativity, the capacity of human beings to carve out joy in the unlikely circumstances. In parlors, in back alleys, in classrooms, in boarding houses, in gardens, in letters. In silence itself, the pulse of Forbidden's love continued, steady and enduring. A quiet defiance that no law or sermon could extinguish. The deeper one moves into the fabric of Victorian life. The more visible becomes the extraordinary range of strategies by which men and women navigate their forbidden desires. And among these strategies, none was more significant than the use of coded culture, a language of symbols and references that transformed art, fashion, and literature into quiet declarations of identity. For a green carnation worn in a lapel might mean nothing to the casual eye, but spoke volumes to those who knew. While a reference to Greek love in a poem could ignite recognition in readers searching desperately for affirmation. The salons of London and Paris thrived on this coded communication, their walls filled with paintings that lingered a little too long on the male form, their libraries stocked with volumes of poetry and philosophy that celebrated ideals of beauty, rooted in antiquity. In such spaces, men and women found one another through art, gathering around shared references that doubled as confession and shield. The pre-Raphaelite painters were particularly skilled at creating images that blurred lines of affection, their glowing canvases filled with sensual gazes that did not always align with conventional gender roles. And within their circles of artists and patrons, there were whispered stories of relationships carried on in the midst of creativity. Literature, too, became a vessel of survival, with authors who could not speak openly weaving their longing into fictional characters, creating novels, where friendships pulsed with undercurrents of love, leaving it to readers to decide how much was meant. For women, the novel became both refuge and mirror, allowing them to imagine attachments that society dismissed as fanciful, but which resonated with the truth of their own hearts. And in drawing rooms across Britain, women exchanged books as though they were gifts of recognition, their marginalia and underlined passages, creating a dialogue invisible to the world outside. The coded culture extended beyond art into daily behavior. The way a man lit a cigarette, the choice of a flower in his buttonhole, the cut of his coat could all be read by those who understood the signs. Cafes and taverns developed reputations, becoming gathering points where recognition could take place without words. For those who lacked access to elite salons, these public spaces became lifelines, environments where laughter, glances, and shared jokes created fragile communities. Police reports record their existence, though always in tones of suspicion. Yet through those hostile accounts, we can sense the reality of lives being lived with resilience and ingenuity. Even humor was coded. Jokes that seemed harmless to outsiders carried layers of meaning among those who shared the secret. And through humor, bonds were strengthened, fear was softened, and existence was affirmed. Scandal, however, remained a constant threat. The press delighted in exposing individuals caught in compromising circumstances, and the late century saw a proliferation of articles detailing arrests and trials. The language of these reports was always heavy with condemnation, Yet, the very details provided insights into how lives were actually lived. A police officer describing two men strolling too closely in a park, a servant recounting overheard whispers, a landlord testifying about unusual guests. All these fragments, though intended to shame, now reveal the persistence of love under siege. For the individuals involved, the cost was devastating. Reputation could be destroyed overnight, families shattered, livelihoods lost. And yet, even in the midst of such cruelty, some refused to deny themselves entirely. Diaries kept during these scandals reveal voices of sorrow, but also of defiance, insisting that love, though condemned, remained true. The world of women carried different risks. While the law ignored them, gossip did not. A pair of women living together might escape prosecution, but not whispers, and such whispers could limit their social lives, their employment, their acceptance in communities. Yet many endured the gossip and continued to build their lives together, trusting that the security of companionship outweighed the sting of rumor. Their homes became sanctuaries filled with gardens, books, and shared rituals, places where love could grow in ordinary gestures. To imagine two women sitting by a fire, sewing by lamplight, exchanging glances over a piece of music played on the piano, is to recognize the quiet bravery of their devotion. History may not have named them, but their lives mattered. Forming threads in the tapestry of resilience. Colonial service also produced new complexities. British officials abroad enforced harsh laws against local populations while quietly living lives of ambiguity themselves. In remote stations, bonds between men grew intense, born of isolation and danger. And though courts occasionally prosecuted, letters and journals show a softer picture of affection that sustained men through hardship. The hypocrisy of condemning in others what one quietly practiced oneself became a defining contradiction of empire. And that contradiction would leave long shadows across the world in the form of legal systems designed to repress what could never truly be extinguished. Through all these layers, art, literature, coded gestures, scandals, colonial encounters, the essence remains the same. Love survived. It whispered in salons, laughed in taverns, lingered in parks, thrived in letters, and endured in households built on companionship. To read the fragments left behind is to hear those whispers still, faint but insistent, reminding us that repression cannot silence the heart. And as the fog of Victorian streets lifts in our imagination, what remains is not only the cruelty of the laws, but the creativity of the people who live beneath them, their capacity to carve out tenderness in a world determined to deny them, their insistence on living love in whatever form they could to picture the hidden landscape of homosexuality in the Victorian era. One must also turn to the quieter rhythms of everyday life, the ways in which desire folded itself into the routines of work, family, and leisure. Always concealed, yet always present, shaping gestures and choices too subtle for official records to capture, but still felt in the silences between words. In offices and shops, men spent long hours together, their companionship sometimes sliding into intimacy that dared not speak its name, their letters to one another filled with references to mundane details that carried undertones of longing. A note about the weather, about a meeting, about a missed appointment could mask an ache for presence. For women, companionship often grew in the shared duties of daily life. A schoolmistress living with her colleague, a governess exchanging letters with a friend, their relationships described as practical, yet infused with devotion that sustained them across years. Diaries record the quiet joy of sharing meals, of reading aloud in the evenings, of walking arm in arm through gardens, rituals of ordinary life that became sacred in their constancy. These were not lives of scandal or notoriety, but of endurance, of carving space for tenderness within a culture that refused to acknowledge it. The law's shadow, however, stretched into all corners, and the constant threat of exposure shaped how people lived. Blackmail became a cruel industry in itself, preying particularly on men of the middle and upper classes, who feared not only imprisonment but social ruin. A single accusation, true or not, could unravel entire families. Letters intercepted by servants, chance encounters witnessed by strangers, careless words repeated in the wrong company all provided fuel for extortion. Some men paid vast sums to silence blackmailers, while others fled abroad to escape scandal. Cities like Paris and Berlin offered relative freedom, and British men of means sometimes sought refuge there, blending into expatriate communities where same-sex love, though still contested, was less harshly policed. Travel, then, became not only leisure but escape, a chance to breathe more freely, to experience a world less bound by the suffocating codes of respectability at home. Artistic circles offered a kind of refuge, but even their risk was present. Painters, actors, and writers often drew suspicion for their flamboyance, and while some embraced notoriety as a mask of protection, others were destroyed by exposure. Theaters, especially, were places of double life. The audience saw glamour and wit, but behind the curtains friendships deepened into romance. Actors and patrons exchanging affections in private rooms that glittered with laughter yet carried the constant anxiety of discovery. Within these circles, language itself became layered. To speak of beauty, of inspiration, of devotion, was to hint at more, and those who listened carefully understood. This subtlety made art both shield and confession, enabling people to live truths they could not declare outright. Meanwhile, in working-class communities, encounters were often fleeting, taking place in parks, alleys, and pubs, yet they carried the same human intensity. Police reports describe raids on public urinals where men of all classes mingled, arrested, together despite the vast differences in their lives. Though the authorities saw only crime, in reality, these encounters reflected the irrepressible force of desire cutting across boundaries of wealth and status. In those moments, the divisions of society collapsed, and what remained was simply the recognition of one human being in another. For many, such meetings were the only expression of their true selves, brief though they were, and their memory lingered long after, written in coded diaries or remembered in silence. Religion continued to complicate matters. Sermons thundered about sin, and yet within the pews sat men and women holding secrets in their hearts. Some sought to reconcile their love with their faith, interpreting biblical stories through lenses of affection, finding in David and Jonathan, in Ruth and Naomi, not warnings but examples of sacred devotion. Others despaired, convinced of their damnation, yet unable to extinguish what they felt. The tension between faith and desire produced torment, but also resilience, as individuals carved private interpretations that allowed them to carry both God and love in the same heart even when churches condemned them. These struggles are preserved in the diaries of clergymen who wrestled with their conscience, torn between vows of celibacy, devotion to parishioners, and affections that grew despite themselves. Their words reveal both anguish and tenderness. Glimpses of men trying to live with honesty within impossible contradictions. The contradictions of Victorian masculinity further shaped this hidden history. Men were encouraged to form intense bonds with one another in schools, universities, and the army, bonds described as noble, patriotic, or intellectual, yet punished the moment those bonds crossed into intimacy, the line between permitted friendship and forbidden love was impossibly thin, and navigating it required constant care. In letters between soldiers, in notes passed between students, we see the tension of expressing affection without crossing into language that could destroy reputations. Yet in those same documents, when read carefully, one can feel the undercurrent of devotion that no amount of restraint could erase. Women's experiences, though less documented, reveal similar contradictions. Romantic friendships between women were celebrated as pure and elevating, yet when those friendships deepened into intimacy, they were either ignored or dismissed as impossible. This refusal to acknowledge female passion provided cover, but it also erased recognition. Still, women found ways to affirm one another, through households built on companionship, through gardens tended together, through letters filled with phrases of love disguised as sentiment. Their devotion, though seldom recorded in courts or Newspapers remains inscribed in the spaces they created together. Homes filled with books, music, and shared life. Across all these lives, what emerges is a picture of extraordinary resilience. In a world that condemned them, men and women still found ways to love, to laugh, to create, and to endure. They wove secrecy into art, turned friendship into sanctuary, transformed silence into a language of its own. Their stories remind us that history is not only the record of laws and scandals, but also the quiet persistence of the heart. In every coded letter, in every disguised gesture, in every whispered joke, there was defiance and survival. A refusal to let repression erase humanity. And though society may not have recognized them, their lives mattered, leaving echoes that continue to resonate long after the gas lamps dimmed and the fog of Victorian London faded into memory as the Victorian age progressed. The tension between secrecy and revelation grew sharper, and nowhere was this more apparent than in the evolving discourse of science and medicine, which sought to catalog and define every aspect of human life, including desire, and in doing so inadvertently gave language to experiences that had long existed without names. Physicians, alienists, and early sexologists began writing case studies of what they call inverts or sexual perverts, describing men and women who confessed to desires for their own sex. These studies were framed in clinical terms, often harsh, often pathologizing, yet within their pages are fragments of testimony that still carry the pulse of human honesty. A man might tell a doctor that he had loved another since childhood. A woman might describe her longing for a friend, and though the physician labeled them abnormal, the words themselves preserve the truth of affection. To read these documents today is to hear voices otherwise lost, voices that dared to describe themselves in a time when silence was enforced. In a strange way, even condemnation became preservation, a paradox at the heart of Victorian history. Meanwhile, public culture continued its double life. Newspapers denounced scandal while secretly feeding an appetite for it. Stories of trials, raids, and arrests filled columns with details that readers consumed with both moral outrage and voyeuristic fascination. Every trial became theater. The courtrooms packed with spectators, reporters scribbling notes to publish descriptions of love letters, rendezvous, and whispered confessions. For those on trial, humiliation was unbearable, but for readers, the stories became windows into lives otherwise hidden. Thus, even as society condemned, it also ensured that fragments of these lives would be remembered. The spectacle of disgrace revealed far more than authorities intended, leaving behind traces that today allow us to reconstruct the fabric of Forbidden's lives. Beyond the glare of scandal, however, the ordinary continued, for most men and women lived their loves quietly, outside the spotlight of courts and newspapers, in boarding houses, in student rooms, in rented lodgings, in cottages tucked away in the countryside. Relationships unfolded in secrecy and tenderness. A pair of clerks might share a flat described by landlords as mere roommates, but within those walls they built a life together, cooking meals, sharing expenses, exchanging gifts, and falling asleep in the same bed night after night. In villages, women lived together for decades, tending their gardens, hosting neighbors, attending church, their partnership dismissed as eccentricity, but in truth sustained by devotion. These quiet households revealed the persistence of love even when it was unnamed, love that carved space for itself in the overlooked corners of society. The contradictions extended even into institutions meant to enforce morality. The Army and Navy, filled with young men living in close quarters, fostered bonds that blurred into intimacy. Court-martials occasionally prosecuted soldiers for indecency, but letters from military men also reveal bonds of companionship that carried unmistakable passion. In barracks, on ships, in colonial stations, the enforced closeness of life produced attachments stronger than regulations could suppress. For those far from home, love became survival, a source of comfort amid danger. At the same time, the hypocrisy of empire persisted. British officials enforced laws against same-sex love in the colonies while living ambiguous lives themselves. The shadow of those laws remains in many places even today, a legacy of Victorian. Repression exported across the globe. For women, invisibility was both protection and erasure. Romantic friendships between women were celebrated in novels and letters, but when those friendships grew into intimacy, they were either ignored or denied by society at large. This denial allowed many women to live openly with each other, sharing homes, finances, and lives, yet it also meant their love was never named. Diaries and letters preserved the truth, revealing tenderness, passion, and sometimes frustration at the lack of recognition. One woman wrote of her lifelong partner as her only true companion, a phrase that carried far deeper meaning than polite society would admit. Their devotion challenges us to see the Victorian world not only through the lens of repression, but also through the resilience of those who built lives of quiet. Authenticity, art, and literature continue to provide mirrors for these hidden lives. Painters explored themes of beauty that hinted at forbidden attraction, while poets cloaked longing in references to antiquity or in metaphors that masked their intent. Readers who recognized themselves in these works found solace, a sense that they were not alone. The circulation of Walt Whitman's poetry in Britain was particularly significant, offering bold celebrations of male love that resonated deeply with readers searching for affirmation. Annotated copies of his work reveal marginal notes, underlined passages, silent conversations between the poet and his hidden audience. Through such texts, people found recognition across oceans, recognition denied by their own culture, but preserved in the lines of a foreign poet. Despite repression, humor endured as a strategy of survival. Within private gatherings, in salons, and taverns, in whispered conversations on darkened streets, men and women laughed at the absurdity of their predicament, at the clumsy ignorance of authorities, at the contradictions of morality that condemned them in theory but consumed their stories in practice. Humor created community, softened fear, and transformed secrecy into solidarity. It was a reminder that even in repression, joy could be found. And so, through science and scandal, through ordinary households and colonial outposts, through art and laughter, the hidden history of homosexuality in the Victorian era remained alive, insistent, refusing to disappear, its quiet persistence a testament to the endurance of love in the face of silence. The hidden history of homosexuality in the Victorian era can also be traced through the quiet rituals of daily life. The habits and choices that on the surface appeared ordinary, but beneath carried layers of meaning. For a simple walk in the park, a visit to the theater, a shared carriage ride, or the exchange of small tokens could hold within them entire stories of affection and risk. And to imagine these lives more clearly is to step into the interiors of parlors and sitting rooms, places where families gathered, yet where secrets quietly pulsed beneath the surface. A bachelor hosting evening gatherings of music and conversation might be remembered by his neighbors as simply sociable, but in reality, his home served as a refuge for men who understood one another, their laughter and subtle glances weaving bonds that outsiders did not detect. In larger houses, young servants often carried stories of their master's private lives, sometimes protecting secrets out of loyalty, sometimes betraying them for money or out of fear. And these servants became unwilling witnesses to lives that official history refused to acknowledge. Diaries occasionally mention them, describing the risk of dependence on those who could at any moment reveal what had been hidden for years. Trust was fragile, yet necessary, for secrecy required cooperation. And secrecy was the foundation upon which these private worlds were built. In universities, bonds between students continued to form with remarkable intensity, sheltered beneath the guise of friendship and intellectual devotion. Letters from young men at Oxford and Cambridge reveal passions barely disguised by scholarly language, one writing to another that he longed for the hours by the river and could think of nothing but the embrace of his companion's presence. Teachers, themselves sometimes sympathetic, looked away, allowing attachments to grow so long as they did not cause scandal. The study of Greek and Latin provided a constant justification, for to speak of Plato or Homer was to open a door to conversations about love between men, and within those ancient texts students found a mirror of their own lives. This blending of scholarship and emotion gave legitimacy to what society denied, embedding desire in the very fabric of intellectual life. For many, these youthful attachments became the defining emotional experiences of their lives, carried in memory long after marriage and convention forced silence. The Army and Navy provided yet another environment where love and intimacy emerged the spaces between duty and discipline. Men living in barracks, sleeping side by side, eating together, facing danger together, often developed bonds that surpassed friendship. Military life demanded closeness, and within that closeness affection blossomed. Court records reveal prosecutions, but letters home described tenderness that no punishment could erase. A soldier in India wrote of a comrade as "my strength in the lonely nights," words that suggest more than camaraderie. Such bonds, though forbidden, became survival, a means of enduring the hardship of service far from home. Yet the same empire that allowed these attachments to form also exported repression, imposing British laws on colonies across the globe. The contradiction is stark. Intimacy thrived in the very structures that enforced silence. For women, invisibility continued to offer both freedom and denial. A pair of women living together could be described as companions, their relationship dismissed as eccentricity. Yet within their homes they built entire worlds of devotion. Letters preserved from such households speak of joy in the ordinary, in meals shared, in walks taken, in the comfort of falling asleep beside one another. Some wrote of jealousy, of the fear of separation, of the ache of absence, words that make clear that these were not friendships but loves. Yet because society chose not to name them, they passed without scandal, their lives allowed to continue. In a kind of protective obscurity, the homes they built became sanctuaries, filled with books, gardens, and music, ordinary to outsiders, extraordinary to those who knew the truth of what sustained them. The role of the press in shaping perception cannot be overlooked. Newspapers thrived on scandal, publishing lurid accounts of trials, yet their words betray a fascination as much as a condemnation. The very act of detailing encounters, of printing letters, of describing gestures, meant that stories of forbiddance, love circulated widely, even if cloaked in outrage. Readers consumed these accounts with equal parts horror and curiosity, and in doing so, the press unwittingly preserved a record of lives it sought to shame. Court transcripts, though cruel, remain some of the richest sources for understanding the reality of same-sex love in the Victorian world. In them, we hear voices otherwise silenced, words of longing spoken under oath, fragments of truth revealed in the midst of humiliation. Amid all of this, humor and creativity remained vital. Men joked about the absurd ignorance of the authorities, turning danger into shared laughter. Women named flowers in their gardens after each other, embedding their devotion in nature itself. Artists painted works filled with subtle defiance. Scholars embedded longing in footnotes and translations. Actors winked at audiences with meanings only some would catch. These acts, small yet profound, reveal the resilience of human spirit. Love, denied legitimacy, reinvented itself endlessly, finding ways to survive through disguise, through ritual, through art. The Victorian age is remembered for its repression, yet within that repression lay an entire hidden universe of passion, tenderness, fear, resilience, and joy. To glimpse it is to realize that history is not only made of wars, inventions, and public figures, but also the quiet persistence of those who dared to love in defiance of silence. Their lives, though overlooked by the official record, continue to breathe in every surviving letter, every coded gesture, every fragment of testimony. And in remembering them, we uncover not simply a story of restriction, but a story of endurance, a reminder that love endures even when forbidden, shaping lives in ways that no law, no sermon, no punishment could fully erase. To enter the later. decades of the Victorian era is to witness how secrecy became ever more carefully woven into the daily fabric of existence, and the lives of men and women who love outside convention reveal both a remarkable creativity and a constant vulnerability. For in households, theaters, libraries, and gardens, affection persisted despite the looming shadow of exposure. In the homes of the middle classes, one could find men who lived as lifelong bachelors, a term often used to conceal relationships sustained quietly over years. Their neighbors might describe them as eccentric, devoted to books, or overly fond of travel, but within their parlors, there existed bonds as deep as any recognized marriage. Dinner parties were held where companions sat side by side, exchanging glances and subtle gestures, their intimacy hidden in plain sight. Family members sometimes suspected, but chose silence, for to name what was happening would have threatened reputation and inheritance. In such silence, love survived, written into the everyday rituals of meals, letters, and companionship. Women, too, created such households, their partnerships justified by the language of friendship. A pair of women who lived together were sometimes called inseparable friends. Their devotion brushed aside as quaint, but in their letters we find longing, jealousy, and passion as unmistakable as any romantic love. Their gardens, their books, their carefully preserved correspondence, all speak of lives built on quiet defiance. In working-class neighborhoods, encounters took different forms. Taverns and music halls provided cover for meetings, with laughter and drink disguising desire. Public parks, urinals, and darkened streets remain dangerous sites of connection, yet men return to them again and again, drawn by need and by the possibility of recognition. Arrest records revealed the constant presence of police, yet also the resilience of those who continue to seek each other out. The mingling of classes in such spaces was striking. A laborer, a clerk, and a gentleman might meet under the same lamplight. Their differences dissolved in the urgency of desire. For some, these fleeting encounters were the only expression of a hidden self. For others, they led to relationships that endured in secret, nurtured in letters and private meetings. The risk was immense, yet the pursuit of companionship outweighed it. Universities and schools remained fertile ground for attachments. The closeness of study, the shared rituals of learning, and the immersion in classical texts created an environment where friendships deepened into intimacy. The very structure of education, with its emphasis on male camaraderie and admiration for ancient ideals, provided cover for passions that would otherwise have no space. Letters written between students, preserved in archives, reveal bonds that survived decades. Men writing to one another as married life and careers drew them apart, their words filled with memory and yearning. The dual life demanded by society meant that many never acted fully on their desires, yet the emotional truth remained unshaken. These bonds, rooted in youth, shaped their sense of self for a lifetime. In the world of art and literature, expression continued through codes and illusions. Painters found ways to explore male beauty in ways that satisfied both their patrons and their own longing. Writers embedded affection in the guise of classical reference or moral allegory. Poets left behind verses whose ambiguity concealed more than they revealed. Readers who shared their experience understood, underlining passages, exchanging books with knowing smiles. Walt Whitman's poetry remained a touchstone, his celebration of comradeship and male love resonating deeply with readers in Britain who longed for such affirmation. Private collections of his work reveal notes, initials, and underlined lines that serve as silent conversations across oceans. For women, novels offered similar mirrors, with stories of passionate friendship providing both recognition and concealment. The culture of the age, though repressive, still offered cracks through which light entered, sustaining those who lived in silence. The law's weight grew heavier after 1885, when the Labouchere Amendment criminalized all acts of gross indecency between men, regardless of proof of physical relations. This vague yet sweeping statute made virtually any suspicion dangerous. Letters, gestures, even proximity could be construed as evidence. Blackmail became rampant and fear haunted daily life. Yet paradoxically, the cruelty of the law preserved. Testimony. Court transcripts filled with letters read aloud, diaries confiscated, and testimonies forced under oath created archives that, while humiliating at the time, now serve as precious evidence of lives otherwise erased. These documents allow us to hear voices unfiltered by historians, raw expressions of affection spoken in desperation. They are painful to read, yet they reveal that even under threat, love found words. Religion remained a source of torment and refuge. Many wrote of their struggle to reconcile their love with their faith. Prayers filled with anguish over what they were taught to see as sin. Others found comfort in reinterpreting scripture, seeing in biblical friendships reflections of their own devotion. Hymns, prayers, and rituals became settings for hidden affection. The shared glance during a sermon, the touch of hands in prayer. Clergymen themselves sometimes recorded struggles in diaries, confessing desires they could not voice aloud. Their writings reveal both despair and a stubborn refusal to deny the truth of their hearts. The church, a site of condemnation, also became a place where love quietly endured. Through all of these fragments, letters, diaries, court records, novels, paintings, whispered jokes, secret gestures, we see not only repression but persistence. The Victorians built walls of morality, yet within those walls, human beings carved out space for connection, joy, and tenderness. Their strategies were endless: disguise, code, humor, art, silence, and ritual. Each was a way of saying, we exist, even if the world refused to hear it. And in this persistence lies the true untold history, not one of erasure but of survival, where love, though denied legitimacy, refused to disappear, shaping lives in ways history can never fully erase. As the gas lamps of Victorian London fade in imagination and the echoes of its hidden lives grow quiet, what lingers is not only the shadow of repression, but the resilience of love that refused to vanish. For in every letter folded secretly into a drawer, in every coded glance exchanged under the glow of a street lamp, in every diary written in cipher, there existed a defiance that history could not fully erase. The courts may have thundered with condemnation, the newspapers may have spilled ink in scandal, and the pulpits may have preached eternal punishment. Yet behind closed doors, men and women built lives of tenderness, however fragile, and carved sanctuaries of companionship where joy was possible. Their worlds were filled with contradictions, fear mingled with laughter, silence bound to devotion, secrecy tied to survival. Yet through it all they created a testament to the endurance of the human heart. To imagine their lives is to imagine the quiet of a London street after rain, where footsteps echo softly and windows glow dimly with lamplight, behind which sit figures who dare to reach across the forbiddens, whispering words that have no place in sermons but every place in the soul. Though history sought to bury them, they remain present in fragments, in archives, in stories pieced together from trial records and forgotten letters, voices that now speak again, reminding us that love is never truly absent, even when unnamed. Perhaps as you rest now, eyes heavy with sleep, you can feel their persistence as a gentle hum beneath the surface of time, a signal carried across centuries that says love has always existed, has always resisted silence, and will always find a way to endure, even in the most unlikely and unwelcoming of ages. Sleep then, with the comfort of knowing that what was once hidden is now remembered, that the untold history breathes again in your hearing, and that the hearts who once walked in shadows are no longer alone.